UFC Fight Night, Marvin Vettori versus Paulo the Eraser Costa. Hello everybody and welcome back to another episode of the Prefight Breakdowns with me, your host Danish on the bottom line. Today I'm here to talk about the upcoming Fight Night event and the headliner where Paulo the Eraser Costa will be taking on Marvin Vettori for a high stakes matchup in the middleweight division of the UFC, and the event comes to you live October the 23rd from the UFC Apex. Check your local listings. And when talking about this matchup, these two gentlemen, I think it does come down to a stylistic matchup at some point. If you've seen Vettori's performances in the past, he hasn't really had the ability to blow anyone away. I mean, he's held his own both times against Izzy, and that's nothing to sneeze at. That's something that's a big feather in his cap. But if you see the way Vettori fights, if you've seen his performances against a host of opponents, some well-respected, some not quite on the same level as the others, but he's been sort of a subdued, technical, thought-out fighter who doesn't really try anything too crazy during the fights. Well, in terms of styles, Paulo is a different animal. He comes guns blazing with everything he's got, all power all the time, with the exception, of course, his last fight against Israel Adesanya. We'll see how it goes, but in terms of styles, I think the Eraser takes this one. I think his force, his ability to just take the pace, take the fight to his opponent is going to be too much for the number 5 ranked Vettori to take. Well, what do I know? We'll see how it goes down come October the 23rd. Now let's look at both our contenders for this fight. Marvin Vettori coming off a recent loss to the champion Israel Adesanya. Let's see what his last 5 have looked like and what Marvin brings to this fight. So Marvin's biggest claim to fame is his 2 fights versus the current champion Israel Adesanya. The first time around it was a 3-rounder, and this was well before Izzy actually became the champion of the middleweights in the UFC. Now that first fight, Marvin's claim to fame was that he took a split decision loss to Israel Adesanya. Well, we need to get into that fight a little bit more to give you some perspective. I watched that fight over and over again just to see if that split decision was actually a well-deserved one. I disagree with that decision. That was just another case of UFC judging gone bad. Izzy won that fight very clearly. He had those first 2 rounds squarely in the box, and even that 3rd round, the questionable 3rd round, where Marvin supposedly took Israel Adesanya down twice. Well, in my book, the takedowns weren't really too effective. Both times, Izzy popped right back up. Marvin was unable to do any real damage, and Izzy was winning in the transitions. So I think I'd give that fight to Israel Adesanya. Well, Marvin went through a bunch of other opponents. None of his performances have really been standout sort of, look at me, I'm here, I have arrived in this division kind of performances. And that carried on for a while before he made a case to fight Adesanya again. And that wasn't so much a case of him wanting to fight Adesanya and the UFC thinking he deserved it. Adesanya had basically laid waste to the entire division. That division right now is Israel Adesanya, and then a huge chasm of gaps, Bobby Knuckles basically, and then everybody else. So they had to give him someone because Robert Whittaker wasn't ready to take on Izzy again. He had just beaten the number 1 contender Paulo Costa, so there was nobody left, and Vettori got a second shot. In that second shot, this time a 5-rounder, it became pretty clear that these men did not belong in the same class. There's a reason why Israel Adesanya is the undisputed, undefeated as a middleweight champion of the UFC, and Vettori is ranked 5. Now, Vettori is not really a specialist at any one thing. He strikes pretty well, he's decent on the ground, his wrestling and takedowns aren't too bad, but he's going up against a man who is a different animal. Now, the opponent standing across from him in that octagon is a giant, an Adonis of a man. I'm really not sure how he continues to make 185, but let's take a look at Paulo Costa's rise to the top. Now, Paulo's had fewer fights than Vettori in the UFC. But his last two fights, and those are the ones I'd focus on in Paulo's career, was his loss against Israel Adesanya, where he put in a completely lackluster performance. How much of that was down to Izzy, and how much was that down to Paulo actually stepping up to the biggest fight of his life, and the nerves and maybe a bad weight cut and all those other factors and a bunch of other excuses that he made? I don't know. The fact is, his first high-profile fight, he went up against Yoel Romero. And I mean, that was a fight that is a bottom line recommendation for a must watch. Those two behemoths, and I mean, there's nobody that can stand across the octagon from Yoel Romero and not look like an inadequate man. Well, Paulo Costa is that exception. Standing across the octagon from Yoel, he looked every bit the challenger that Yoel needed. And my God, was that a fight. I mean, I remember at one point, Paulo threw up that sneaky leg kick and caught Yoel square on his face. I mean, as clean as a head kick could get. And if you see the stills, take a look at that. It looks like he knocked Yoel's soul out of his body for a second. But in typical Yoel Romero fashion, it didn't even faze him. And at some point during that fight, I remember Yoel calling out to Costa, asking him to meet him in the middle of the ring. And well, Paulo Costa actually answered. He did that old soldier of God walk, marched down to the middle of the ring and stood toe to toe with perhaps one of the scariest men in the world, middleweight or otherwise. So Paulo had been through a tear in that division up to that point. He had, I think, 14, 15 wins, all of which were finishes. He had not been tested. Nobody had been able to take him the distance. He had knocked out everyone and he'd submitted one guy. And then he ran into Yoel. He took a decision home, convincing victory over Yoel, gets put in the limelight, goes up against Adesanya, made a whole bunch of excuses after his loss. He didn't quite look like the Paulo Costa I was expecting in that fight. And like I said before, how much of that was down to Izzy doing his thing and actually dismantling Paulo Costa, because he did a fair bit of that, and how much of it was other factors, bad weight cut, no sleep the previous night, and all that stuff put together, we'll never know. But the fact is, both these men, Marvin Vettori and Paulo Costa, in the words of Daniel Cormier, are fighting for relevance in this division. Because Izzy's taking on Robert Whittaker next. So he takes on Bobby Knuckles to see how that goes. And this is going to be the second time around. We knocked him out the first time. We'll see what happens. But basically, this fight will determine how the middleweight division and its rankings stack up after the next couple of fights in that division. So these two guys fighting for relevance. And I think we haven't yet seen the last of Paulo Costa. I think he's got another run at the title. Whether it's going to be Izzy or somebody else down the line, I'm not so sure. But we'll see how it goes. This one's going to be a very high stakes matchup. And I expect the eraser to come out and do his thing and put Vettori away at some point during this headliner on October the 23rd. This one's promising to be an absolute slugfest. Coming to you live from the Apex Center in Las Vegas. A fantastic fight by the UFC. Keep watching. We'll be bringing you more fight updates.